Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still in the corner of the grand ballroom, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd of wealthy guests. His black suit was crisp and professional, but nothing about him screamed importance. To everyone at the charity gala, he was just another security guard, invisible, unimportant, and easily ignored. The event was being held at the Riverside Manor, one of London's most exclusive venues. Politicians, business leaders, and celebrities mingled freely, their laughter echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Marcus had been hired by the security company just 3 weeks ago, and tonight was his first major assignment. "Hey, you there," called out a loud voice from across the room. Marcus turned to see Richard Pemberton, a wealthy real estate developer, approaching with a group of his friends. All of them wore expensive suits and carried themselves with the arrogance that money often brings. "Yes, sir?" Marcus responded quietly, maintaining his professional composure. "We need more champagne at our table," Richard said dismissively, not even looking directly at Marcus. "And make sure it's the good stuff, not the cheap bottles you probably drink." His friends laughed at the comment, finding humor in what they saw as putting the help in their place. Marcus simply nodded and walked toward the service area, ignoring their snickers behind him. As he moved through the crowd, Marcus noticed things others missed. The way the waiter near the kitchen kept checking his watch nervously. How the woman by the window had been taking photos of the exits rather than the artwork. The slight bulge under the jacket of a man who claimed to be a journalist but carried himself like military. These observations came naturally to Marcus, though he kept them to himself. His current colleagues at Premier Security Solutions had no idea about his background. To them, he was just another ex-military guy looking for steady work after leaving the service. "Marcus, right?" asked Sarah Chen, another security guard working the event. She was young, enthusiastic, and had been trying to make conversation with him all evening. "That's right," he replied, accepting the champagne bottles from the catering staff. "I heard you served in Afghanistan," she continued, walking alongside him. "Must have been tough over there." Marcus simply nodded, not offering any details. The truth was far more complex than Sarah could imagine. But he had learned long ago that some stories were better left untold. As they returned to the main floor, Marcus delivered the champagne to Richard's table. The wealthy man barely acknowledged him, too busy boasting to his companions about his latest business deal. "The problem with people like him," Richard was saying loudly, gesturing toward Marcus as if he wasn't there, "is they have no ambition, happy to stand around in a uniform, taking orders from their betters. Probably couldn't handle a real job anyway," added one of his friends, a thin man with a cruel smile. "These military types are all the same. Good at following orders, but useless when it comes to thinking for themselves." Marcus set down the champagne without a word, but something flickered in his eyes for just a moment. Sarah, who was standing nearby, caught the expression and felt a chill run down her spine. There was something dangerous in that look, something that suggested these men had no idea who they were mocking. "Thank you," Richard said with exaggerated politeness, pulling out a single-pound coin. "Here's a tip for your excellent service." He placed it on the table with a smirk, causing his friends to burst into laughter again. Marcus looked at the coin for a moment, then back at Richard. "Very generous, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. As the evening progressed, Marcus continued his patrol of the venue. He noticed that the nervous waiter had disappeared entirely, and the woman taking photos had moved to a position near the main entrance. The fake journalist was now standing close to the stage where the evening's keynote speaker would soon address the crowd. These details accumulated in Marcus's mind like pieces of a puzzle, but he maintained his calm exterior. Years of training had taught him to observe without appearing to watch, to analyze without showing concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the event coordinator, "please take your seats for tonight's presentation." The crowd began to settle down, moving toward the arranged seating area. Marcus positioned himself along the wall, maintaining clear sightlines across the room. From his vantage point, he could see almost everything, every entrance, every potential threat, every person who didn't quite belong. Richard Pemberton had claimed a front row seat, still surrounded by his group of friends. They were now discussing Marcus openly, having consumed enough alcohol to make them even less considerate than usual. "I bet he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn," Richard was saying, his voice carrying across the quiet room. These grunt soldiers are all about following orders, not skill. Probably never even saw real combat, agreed another man. Just stood guard at some safe base pretending to be important. Marcus heard every word but showed no reaction. He had learned long ago that some people's opinions weren't worth acknowledging, regardless of how wrong they might be. The keynote speaker, a prominent humanitarian, took the stage and began discussing the charity's work in conflict zones around the world. As she spoke about the brave individuals who risked their lives to help others, Marcus found himself remembering faces from his past, teammates who hadn't made it home, missions that had shaped him into someone these wealthy guests could never understand. But tonight wasn't about the past. Tonight was about doing his job, staying alert and ensuring everyone went home safely. Even Richard Pemberton and his obnoxious friends deserved protection, whether they appreciated it or not. As the speaker continued her presentation, Marcus noticed the fake journalist checking his phone and then moving slowly toward the back of the room. At the same time, a new figure appeared near the service entrance, someone who definitely hadn't been on the guest list. Years of experience told Marcus that something was about to happen, something that would test every skill he had learned during his time in places these guests had only read about in newspapers. The question was whether he could handle the situation quietly, without revealing just how wrong Richard Pemberton and his friends were about the simple security guard they had spent the evening mocking. The humanitarian speech about courage in dangerous places was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the main entrance. Marcus had been watching the suspicious movement around the room when 3 armed men burst through the doors, their faces covered by black masks. "Nobody move," shouted the leader, raising an automatic weapon above his head. "This is now under our control." Screams erupted throughout the ballroom as guests dove under tables and behind pillars. The crystal chandeliers seemed to tremble from the chaos below as people scrambled for safety. Marcus immediately assessed the situation with cold precision. 3 visible attackers at the front entrance, the fake journalist now revealing a concealed weapon near the stage, and the nervous waiter had returned through the kitchen entrance with what appeared to be explosives strapped to his chest. 5 threats total. Multiple exits blocked, approximately 200 civilians in immediate danger, everyone on the ground. "Now!" screamed one of the attackers, firing a burst into the ceiling. Chunks of plaster rained down on the terrified guests. Richard Pemberton, who had been so confident and dismissive just minutes earlier, was now cowering behind an overturned table with his friends. His face had gone completely white, and his expensive suit was already wrinkled from crawling across the floor. "Please," he whimpered to one of the attackers who approached his hiding spot. "I have money. I can pay whatever you want." The masked man laughed cruelly. "We're not here for your money, rich boy. We're here to make a statement." Marcus remained perfectly still against the wall, analyzing every detail. The attackers moved with military precision, but their equipment was mixed, some professional grade, some clearly improvised. Their leader kept checking his watch, suggesting they were working to a specific timeline. "Sarah," Marcus whispered to the young security guard who had frozen in terror nearby, "when I give you the signal, you need to get to the fire exit behind the stage and call for backup." "What signal?" she whispered back, her voice shaking. "What are you going to do?" But Marcus was already moving, using the chaos and overturned furniture as cover. His years of training in hostile environments had taught him how to become invisible even in plain sight, how to move without making sound, how to strike without warning. The terrorist near the kitchen was nervous, constantly adjusting the explosive device on his chest. Marcus could see it was a crude setup, dangerous but not sophisticated. More importantly, the man was young and scared, making him unpredictable but also vulnerable. "Attention, everyone," the leader announced from the stage, his voice echoing through the sound system. "We represent the Freedom Liberation Front, and tonight you will witness our power." Marcus had never heard of this group, but their tactics were familiar. Create maximum fear, control the space, use civilians as leverage, standard terrorist playbook, but executed by people who weren't quite as professional as they wanted to appear. Moving like a shadow, Marcus approached the kitchen terrorist from behind. The young man was so focused on watching the main room that he never noticed the silent figure closing in on him. In one fluid motion, Marcus disabled the explosive device with techniques learned from countless bomb disposal situations. then applied a sleeper hold that rendered the terrorist unconscious within seconds. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds and made almost no sound. 1 down. 4 to go. Where are the security guards? Demanded the leader, suddenly noticing that his kitchen accomplice was no longer visible. Find them and bring them here. Richard Pemberton, still hiding behind his table, caught sight of Marcus moving through the shadows near the wall. There! He shouted, pointing directly at Marcus. There's one of them. Every terrorist in the room turned toward Marcus's position. For a moment, the entire ballroom fell silent except for the quiet sobs of terrified guests. Marcus stepped out from behind the pillar, his hands visible and empty. To the attackers, he appeared to be exactly what Richard had called him earlier. Just another security guard, scared and outmatched. Well, well, said the leader, approaching with his weapon trained on Marcus. Look what we have here. A hero, perhaps. Just doing my job, Marcus replied calmly, his voice showing none of the fear that filled the room. Your job? The terrorist laughed. Your job is to stand around and look important. This is real violence, soldier boy. This is war. Marcus said nothing, but his eyes were constantly moving, calculating distances and angles. The fake journalist was positioned 15 feet to his left. 2 attackers flanked the leader in front of him. Multiple civilians were in potential crossfire zones. You know what I think? The leader continued, enjoying what he believed was complete control of the situation. I think you're going to kneel down right here and show these rich people how powerless their protectors really are. Richard Pemberton and his friends watched in terrified fascination, probably expecting Marcus to surrender immediately. After all, they had spent the entire evening convinced he was nothing more than a simple guard with no real skills or courage. I'm going to give you 10 seconds, the leader said, checking his watch again. Kneel down or I start shooting these fancy people one by one. The countdown began. Marcus could see Sarah near the back wall, positioned close to the fire exit as he had instructed. The remaining guests were clustered in groups, some crying, others paralyzed with fear. 10, 9, 8. Marcus noticed the slight tremor in the leader's hands. Despite his bravado, the man was nervous too. The operation wasn't going exactly as planned, and the missing kitchen accomplice had clearly unsettled him. 7, 6, 5. The fake journalist was getting restless, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Amateur mistake, it revealed his position to anyone trained to notice such details. 4, 3, 2. Marcus looked directly at the leader, his expression completely calm. Before you reach one, he said quietly, you should know something about the guard you're threatening. The terrorist paused, curious despite himself. What's that, soldier boy? Marcus smiled slightly, and for the first time that evening, Richard Pemberton and his friends caught a glimpse of something that made them question everything they thought they knew about the silent man they had been mocking. I'm not really a security guard, Marcus said, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the entire room. I'm just someone who knows how to handle situations like this. The leader's finger tightened on the trigger, but something in Marcus's tone made him hesitate. There was no fear there, no desperation. Just the calm certainty of a man who had faced far worse than this and lived to tell about it. The moment stretched like eternity as Marcus faced down the terrorist leader. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even Richard Pemberton had stopped whimpering, transfixed by the sudden change in atmosphere. What did you just say? The leader demanded, his weapon wavering slightly. Marcus took a single step forward, ignoring the guns pointed at him. I said I know how to handle situations like this. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk away while you still can. The terrorist laughed, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. You're bluffing. You're just another rent-a-cop trying to play hero. Am I? Marcus asked calmly. Your man in the kitchen is unconscious. Your explosive device has been disarmed, and your escape route through the service entrance is now blocked. The leader's eyes widened. He pressed his radio, trying to contact the kitchen accomplice. Nothing but static answered him back. Impossible, he whispered, then raised his voice to address his remaining team. Check the kitchen, now! But Marcus was already moving. Years of SAS training had taught him that the moment an enemy showed doubt was the moment to strike. He dove to the right just as the leader's finger squeezed the trigger. The bullets meant for him shattering an expensive painting instead. The ballroom erupted into chaos again as Marcus rolled behind a marble pillar. Guests screamed and scattered, making the terrorists' job much harder as they tried to track their target through the panicking crowd. "Find him," screamed the leader. "He's just one man." But Marcus wasn't just one man. He was a ghost, trained in the art of urban warfare and close-quarters combat. While the terrorists searched frantically, he was already behind them, moving through their positions like smoke. The fake journalist never knew what hit him. One moment he was scanning the crowd for Marcus. The next he was unconscious on the floor, his weapon secured and his communications device destroyed. 2 down. 3 to go, this is impossible, shouted one of the remaining attackers, spinning around wildly. Where is he? Richard Pemberton watched in amazement from his hiding spot. The man they had dismissed as a simple security guard was systematically dismantling a terrorist operation with surgical precision. Every movement was calculated, every action purposeful. "Who is this guy?" whispered one of Richard's friends, his earlier mockery replaced by awe. Marcus appeared suddenly behind the third terrorist, applying pressure to a specific point on the man's neck. The attacker dropped his weapon and collapsed instantly. Alive but completely immobilized, the leader was now alone with his final accomplice, both of them back to back in the center of the room. Weapons pointed outward as they tried to cover all possible approaches. "Come out and face us," the leader yelled, his voice cracking with stress. "Stop hiding like a coward." "I'm not hiding," Marcus said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. The acoustics of the ballroom made it impossible to pinpoint his location. "I'm just giving you one last chance to surrender. We'll kill the hostages," threatened the accomplice, grabbing a terrified elderly woman who had been too slow to find cover. Marcus stepped into view then, his hands raised, but his posture relaxed. "Let her go. Your fight is with me, that's right," the leader snarled, regaining some confidence now that he could see his target. "Come closer, hero. Let's finish this." But as Marcus approached, Richard Pemberton noticed something that made his blood run cold. The quiet security guard wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked almost bored, like this was just another day at the office. "You want to know who I really am?" Marcus asked, stopping just outside the terrorists' effective range. "My name is Marcus Thompson. For 12 years, I was with the Special Air Service, Sniper Division." The leader's face went pale behind his mask. Every soldier in the world knew about the SAS, and their snipers were legendary. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. 3 tours in Afghanistan," Marcus continued conversationally. 2 in Iraq. 47 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 800 meters. But that was with a rifle. He smiled coldly. "Up close like this, I don't need special equipment." The accomplice holding the hostage began to back away, suddenly understanding that they had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't some weekend warrior or ex-military washout. This was a professional killer who had spent years perfecting his craft in the world's most dangerous places. "The old woman you're holding," Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is Margaret Hensworth. She runs a charity that provides medical care to war orphans. She's probably done more good in this world than you ever will." "Shut up," screamed the accomplice, pressing his gun against the woman's head. "You hurt her," Marcus continued, his tone never changing. "And I will hunt you down. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but someday. And when I find you, you'll wish you had died here." The threat was delivered with such quiet certainty that both terrorists took involuntary steps backward. They had dealt with scared civilians and overwhelmed security guards before. But this was something entirely different. Sarah, who had been watching from her position near the fire exit, realized that the backup she was supposed to call might not be necessary after all. The man she had thought was just another colleague was handling the situation with a level of skill that seemed almost supernatural. "Last chance," Marcus said, taking another step forward. "Drop your weapons and walk away. I won't follow you, and neither will the authorities if you leave now." The leader looked around the ballroom, taking in the unconscious bodies of his team members and the terrified faces of the hostages. His carefully planned operation had been completely destroyed by one man, a man they had dismissed as unimportant just minutes earlier. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied. "The only question now is whether you're smart enough to realize it." For a moment, the standoff continued. Then slowly, the accomplice began to lower his weapon. The old woman slipped away from his grasp, moving quickly toward the safety of the other guests. But the leader wasn't ready to give up. With a roar of rage and humiliation, He raised his weapon and fired directly at Marcus, determined to take down the man who had ruined everything. What happened next would be talked about by the survivors for years to come, and Richard Pemberton would never again underestimate anyone based on their appearance or job title. The gunshot echoed through the ballroom like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, Marcus was no longer where he had been standing. The terrorist leader spun frantically, trying to locate his target, but the experienced sniper had vanished like a shadow. "Where did he go?" the accomplice shouted, his nerve finally breaking completely. Before the leader could answer, Marcus materialized behind him with the fluid grace of a predator. Years of moving silently through hostile territory had made him a master of stealth and misdirection. In one smooth motion, Marcus disarmed the leader and applied a combat hold that left the man conscious but completely helpless. The accomplice, seeing his leader captured so effortlessly, dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Smart choice," Marcus said calmly, securing both men with zip ties he had taken from the unconscious terrorists. "Sarah, call the authorities now. Tell them the situation is under control." The young security guard nodded shakily and reached for her radio, still trying to process what she had just witnessed. The man she had worked alongside for 3 weeks had just single-handedly neutralized a terrorist cell, with skills that belonged in action movies, not real life. As the immediate danger passed, the guests began to emerge from their hiding places. Many were still trembling with shock, but their eyes were fixed on Marcus with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Richard Pemberton struggled to his feet, his expensive suit torn and dirty from crawling across the floor. His face was pale and his hands shook as he approached the man he had spent the evening mocking and humiliating. I don't understand," Richard stammered. "You're really SAS? You're actually a soldier?" Marcus finished securing the last terrorist before turning to face him. "Former soldier," he corrected quietly. "I left the service 6 months ago." "But why?" asked one of Richard's friends, his voice filled with confusion. "Why are you working as a security guard if you're some kind of elite special forces operative?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. The truth was complicated, involving classified missions and personal demons that most civilians couldn't understand. "Sometimes people need a break from war," he said finally. "Sometimes they need to remember what normal life feels like." The humanitarian speaker, who had been giving her presentation when the attack began, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "Those men, they would have killed us all." "That was their plan," Marcus confirmed, checking the improvised explosive device he had disabled earlier. "They wanted to make a statement against the wealthy and powerful, use this event to spread fear and gain attention for their cause." "How did you know?" asked Sarah, finally finding her voice. "How did you spot them before they even made their move?" Marcus gestured toward the unconscious fake journalist. He carried himself wrong for a reporter. Too much military bearing, wrong kind of physical fitness. The waiter was nervous, but not in the way service staff usually are before big events. And these three, he indicated the main attackers, spent too much time checking exits and security positions when they arrived. Richard Pemberton listened in growing amazement. While he and his friends had been drinking champagne and making jokes, Marcus had been conducting a professional threat assessment of the entire venue. "You saw all that," Richard said slowly. "And you didn't say anything." "To who?" Marcus asked. "And about what? Suspicious behavior isn't a crime. I had no proof they were planning anything specific." "But you were ready," observed the humanitarian speaker. "I'm always ready," Marcus replied simply. "That's what 12 years of training teaches you." Police sirens could be heard approaching the venue as emergency responders finally arrived. Marcus began organizing the scene, ensuring the injured guests received medical attention and the terrorists were properly secured for transport. "Sir," called one of the first officers through the door, recognizing Marcus immediately. "Sergeant Thompson? What are you doing here?" "Working security," Marcus replied. "And it's just Thompson now. I'm a civilian." The officer, clearly someone who knew Marcus's reputation, looked around at the neutralized terrorists with professional appreciation. "Should have known. When we got the call about a terrorist incident resolved by security, I figured it had to be either very lucky or very skilled." As paramedics attended to the few guests who had been injured in the panic, Richard Pemberton found himself unable to stop staring at Marcus. The man moved with quiet efficiency, helping coordinate the emergency response while avoiding any attention or credit for what he had accomplished. "I owe you an apology," Richard said when he finally worked up the courage to approach Marcus again. Marcus looked at him with neutral eyes. "For what?" For everything I said tonight. For treating you like you were beneath me, for assuming I knew anything about who you are or what you've done. You treated me exactly the way you treat everyone you consider unimportant," Marcus replied without anger. "The problem isn't that you are wrong about me specifically. The problem is that you assume anyone in a service job is automatically less valuable than you are." The words hit Richard like a physical blow because they were absolutely true. He realized that his behavior tonight wasn't an exception. It was his normal pattern of interactions with people he considered below his social class. "How many people have you saved?" asked one of Richard's friends, his earlier mockery completely forgotten. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I don't keep count." "That's not why we do the job. Then why?" Richard pressed. "Why risk your life for strangers? Why put yourself in danger for people who treat you the way I did tonight?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching as the last terrorist was loaded into a police van. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent in places most people only saw on the news. "Because someone has to," he said simply. "Because there are people in this world who will hurt innocent civilians to make a point or gain power. And because everyone deserves the chance to go home safely, regardless of how they treat the people protecting them." The simple honesty of the statement left Richard speechless. He had spent his entire adult life believing that money and status were the measures of a person's worth. But tonight he had been saved by someone whose value couldn't be calculated in dollars or social position. As the evening finally wound down and guests began to leave under police escort, Marcus prepared to give his statement and return to his quiet life. But Richard Pemberton wasn't finished with him yet. The wealthy businessman had questions that needed answers, and a debt of gratitude that demanded acknowledgement. The gunshot echoed through the ballroom like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, Marcus was no longer where he had been standing. The terrorist leader spun frantically, trying to locate his target, but the experienced sniper had vanished like a shadow. "Where did he go?" the accomplice shouted, his nerve finally breaking completely. Before the leader could answer, Marcus materialized behind him with the fluid grace of a predator. Years of moving silently through hostile territory had made him a master of stealth and misdirection. In one smooth motion, Marcus disarmed the leader and applied a combat hold that left the man conscious but completely helpless. The accomplice, seeing his leader captured so effortlessly, dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Smart choice," Marcus said calmly, securing both men with zip ties he had taken from the unconscious terrorists. "Sarah, call the authorities now. Tell them the situation is under control." The young security guard nodded shakily and reached for her radio, still trying to process what she had just witnessed. The man she had worked alongside for 3 weeks had just single-handedly neutralized a terrorist cell, with skills that belonged in action movies, not real life. As the immediate danger passed, the guests began to emerge from their hiding places. Many were still trembling with shock, but their eyes were fixed on Marcus with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Richard Pemberton struggled to his feet, his expensive suit torn and dirty from crawling across the floor. His face was pale and his hands shook as he approached the man he had spent the evening mocking and humiliating. I don't understand," Richard stammered. "You're really SAS? You're actually a soldier?" Marcus finished securing the last terrorist before turning to face him. "Former soldier," he corrected quietly. "I left the service 6 months ago." "But why?" asked one of Richard's friends, his voice filled with confusion. "Why are you working as a security guard if you're some kind of elite special forces operative?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. The truth was complicated, involving classified missions and personal demons that most civilians couldn't understand. "Sometimes people need a break from war," he said finally. "Sometimes they need to remember what normal life feels like." The humanitarian speaker, who had been giving her presentation when the attack began, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "Those men, they would have killed us all." "That was their plan," Marcus confirmed, checking the improvised explosive device he had disabled earlier. "They wanted to make a statement against the wealthy and powerful, use this event to spread fear and gain attention for their cause. How did you know? Asked Sarah, finally finding her voice. How did you spot them before they even made their move? Marcus gestured toward the unconscious fake journalist. He carried himself wrong for a reporter. Too much military bearing, wrong kind of physical fitness. The waiter was nervous, but not in the way service staff usually are before big events. And these three, he indicated the main attackers, spent too much time checking exits and security positions when they arrived. Richard Pemberton listened in growing amazement. While he and his friends had been drinking champagne and making jokes, Marcus had been conducting a professional threat assessment of the entire venue. You saw all that, Richard said slowly. And you didn't say anything. To who? Marcus asked. And about what? Suspicious behavior isn't a crime. I had no proof they were planning anything specific. But you were ready, observed the humanitarian speaker. I'm always ready. Marcus replied simply. That's what 12 years of training teaches you. Police sirens could be heard approaching the venue as emergency responders finally arrived. Marcus began organizing the scene, ensuring the injured guests received medical attention and the terrorists were properly secured for transport. Sir, called one of the first officers through the door, recognizing Marcus immediately. Sergeant Thompson? What are you doing here? Working security, Marcus replied. And it's just Thompson now. I'm a civilian. The officer, clearly someone who knew Marcus's reputation, looked around at the neutralized terrorists with professional appreciation. Should have known. When we got the call about a terrorist incident resolved by security, I figured it had to be either very lucky or very skilled. As paramedics attended to the few guests who had been injured in the panic, Richard Pemberton found himself unable to stop staring at Marcus. The man moved with quiet efficiency, helping coordinate the emergency response while avoiding any attention or credit for what he had accomplished. I owe you an apology, Richard said when he finally worked up the courage to approach Marcus again. Marcus looked at him with neutral eyes. For what? For everything I said tonight. For treating you like you were beneath me, for assuming I knew anything about who you are or what you've done. You treated me exactly the way you treat everyone you consider unimportant, Marcus replied without anger. The problem isn't that you are wrong about me specifically. The problem is that you assume anyone in a service job is automatically less valuable than you are. The words hit Richard like a physical blow because they were absolutely true. He realized that his behavior tonight wasn't an exception. It was his normal pattern of interactions with people he considered below his social class. How many people have you saved? Asked one of Richard's friends, his earlier mockery completely forgotten. Marcus considered the question seriously. I don't keep count. That's not why we do the job. Then why? Richard pressed. Why risk your life for strangers? Why put yourself in danger for people who treat you the way I did tonight? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching as the last terrorist was loaded into a police van. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent in places most people only saw on the news. Because someone has to, he said simply. Because there are people in this world who will hurt innocent civilians to make a point or gain power. And because everyone deserves the chance to go home safely, regardless of how they treat the people protecting them. The simple honesty of the statement left Richard speechless. He had spent his entire adult life believing that money and status were the measures of a person's worth. But tonight he had been saved by someone whose value couldn't be calculated in dollars or social position. As the evening finally wound down and guests began to leave under police escort, Marcus prepared to give his statement and return to his quiet life. But Richard Pemberton wasn't finished with him yet. The wealthy businessman had questions that needed answers, and a debt of gratitude that demanded acknowledgement. 6 months later, Richard Pemberton crouched in the shade of a medical tent in northern Kenya, sweat dripping from his face as he watched Marcus scan the horizon with practiced eyes. The refugee camp spread out before them like a city of canvas and hope, housing thousands of people who had fled violence in neighboring countries. Contact. 2 o'clock, Marcus said quietly into his radio, spotting a dust cloud approaching from the east. Looks like our supply convoy. Richard squinted in the direction Marcus indicated but saw nothing except heat waves rising from the desert floor. After 6 months of working together, he had learned to trust Marcus's enhanced senses completely. How do you see things so far away? Richard asked, adjusting the rifle he now carried with growing competence. Years of practice, Marcus replied, never taking his eyes off the approaching vehicles. In Afghanistan, the difference between spotting movement at 800 meters versus 700 could mean the difference between life and death for your entire unit. The convoy that emerged from the dust was a welcome sight. 3 trucks loaded with medical supplies, food, and water purification equipment. Richard had personally funded this shipment, using his business connections to secure supplies at cost and arrange transportation through dangerous territory. Dr. Amara will be pleased, Richard said, thinking of the camp's head physician who had been rationing antibiotics for the past week. She'll be more pleased when we get these supplies distributed without incident, Marcus replied, maintaining his vigilant watch as the trucks approached the camp perimeter. Richard had learned that Marcus never relaxed his guard, even during routine operations. The man who had once seemed like just another security guard had become Richard's teacher in the art of meaningful vigilance, watching not for personal threats, but for dangers to people who couldn't protect themselves. "Mr. Richard," called a young voice from behind them. Richard turned to see Ahmed, a 10-year-old refugee who had attached himself to the security team. The boy spoke excellent English and had become their unofficial liaison with the camp residents. "Hello, Ahmed," Richard replied, switching to the Arabic he had been learning. "How is your mother today?" "Much better since the medicine you brought," Ahmed answered with a bright smile. "She says to tell you that her prayers include your name now." Such moments still moved Richard deeply. 6 months ago, his greatest concern had been whether his latest real estate deal would net him another £1 million. Now he found genuine satisfaction in knowing that his resources had helped save a mother's life in a refugee camp most of his former associates couldn't locate on a map. "Marcus," came a voice through their radio. "We've got movement on the southern perimeter. Looks like armed vehicles." Marcus immediately shifted his attention, pulling out binoculars to assess the new threat. Richard had learned to read his partner's expressions, and the slight tightening around Marcus's eyes indicated serious concern. "How many?" Marcus asked into his radio. 3 vehicles, maybe 12 men total. "They're not flying any flags, but they're heavily armed." Richard felt his stomach clench with familiar fear. This wasn't his first dangerous situation since joining Marcus's team, but the presence of armed men near a refugee camp always meant potential disaster for thousands of innocent people. "What do we do?" Richard asked, proud that his voice remained steady. "We do our job," Marcus replied simply. "We keep these people safe." Over the months they had worked together, Richard had learned that Marcus's definition of keeping people safe often involved putting himself directly in harm's way. The man seemed to have no concept of self-preservation when civilian lives were at stake. "Dr. Amara needs to prepare for possible casualties," Marcus said into his radio, "and get word to the camp leaders. We may need to implement evacuation procedures for the southern sections." As Marcus coordinated the camp's defensive preparations, Richard found himself thinking about the bizarre journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a wealthy businessman whose biggest worry was which restaurant to choose for dinner. Now he was armed and alert in one of the world's most dangerous regions, using his wealth to fund humanitarian operations while learning combat skills from a former SAS sniper. "The armed group is approaching under a white flag," reported their radio operator. "Looks like they want to talk. Could be legitimate," Marcus mused. "Or it could be a distraction while they position for an attack." "Richard, I need you to coordinate with Dr. Amara about moving the most vulnerable patients to the secure areas we identified." "On it," Richard replied, surprised by how naturally he had adapted to taking orders from someone he had once dismissed as a lowly employee. As Richard hurried toward the medical tent, he reflected on how completely his worldview had changed. The man giving him orders was someone he had mocked for working in the service industry, but Marcus Thompson possessed skills and knowledge that no amount of money could buy. More importantly, he had dedicated his life to protecting people who had no way to repay him. "Dr. Amara," Richard called as he entered the main medical facility. "Marcus says we may need to move critical patients to the bunkers." The Kenyan physician, a woman whose quiet competence had earned Richard's deep respect, immediately began organizing her staff. "How much time do we have?" "Unknown," Richard replied. "Armed group approaching under white flag, but Marcus is treating it as a potential threat." "Smart man," Dr. Amara said, already directing nurses to prepare portable medical equipment. In my experience, people who approach refugee camps with weapons rarely have good intentions. Richard helped move medical supplies to the camp's fortified areas, underground shelters that Marcus had insisted they construct during the first month of operations. At the time, Richard had questioned the expense and effort, but now he was grateful for Marcus's foresight and professional paranoia. "Richard," came Marcus's voice through the radio, "I need you back at the observation post. We're going to need your language skills." Richard grabbed his rifle and headed back to Marcus's position, where he found his partner studying the approaching group through high-powered binoculars. "What do you see?" Richard asked. "Professional fighters," Marcus replied grimly. "Military bearing, quality weapons, coordinated movement. This isn't some random group of bandits. What do they want?" "We're about to find out," Marcus said, handing Richard the binoculars. "They've stopped about 200 meters out. Looks like they're sending a negotiator." Through the lenses, Richard could see a single figure walking toward their position, hands visible and empty. The man wore military-style clothing but no identifying insignia. "Can you handle the translation if he speaks Arabic?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Richard replied, though his mouth felt dry with nervousness. As the figure approached, Richard realized that everything he had learned over the past 6 months was about to be tested. The wealthy businessman who had once cared only about profit margins was now responsible for helping protect thousands of refugees from armed men whose intentions remained unknown. Marcus checked his rifle one final time, his movements calm and professional despite the approaching danger. "Remember," he said quietly, "our job isn't to be heroes. Our job is to keep these people alive, whatever it takes." The negotiator stopped 50 meters from their position and called out in accented English, "We wish to speak with whoever leads this camp." Marcus stood slowly, his rifle visible but not threatening. "I'm head of security here." "What do you want?" "My name is Colonel Rashid," the man replied. "We represent the local militia. This camp sits on territory that belongs to us." Richard felt his blood run cold. Militia groups in this region were notorious for extorting refugee camps, demanding protection money or worse. Some had been known to raid camps entirely, stealing supplies and forcing refugees to flee again. "This is international humanitarian territory," Marcus called back, his voice carrying absolute authority, protected under the Geneva Convention and recognized by the Kenyan government. Colonel Rashid laughed harshly. "Treaties and papers mean nothing here, my friend. Only strength matters. We have come to collect what is owed to us." "And what exactly do you think is owed to you?" Marcus asked, though Richard could tell he already knew the answer. "Half of all supplies that enter this camp, half of all medical equipment, and a payment of 10,000 American dollars per month for our protection." The demands were outrageous, designed to cripple the camp's ability to function. Richard quickly calculated the numbers. The militia was essentially demanding control over the entire operation while providing nothing in return. "That's not going to happen," Marcus said simply. "Then, we will take what we want by force," Colonel Rashid replied. "You have perhaps 20 security personnel. We have over 100 fighters positioned around this camp. Surrender now and no one needs to die today." Richard's hands tightened on his rifle as he realized they were vastly outnumbered. Even with Marcus's skills, there was no way they could fight off 100 attackers while protecting thousands of refugees. But Marcus seemed completely unperturbed by the threat. "Before you make any decisions you'll regret," he called out, "you should know who you're dealing with." "You are aid workers playing at being soldiers," Colonel Rashid scoffed. "What could you possibly do against real fighters?" Marcus smiled, and Richard recognized the same cold expression he had seen in the ballroom 6 months earlier. "My name is Marcus Thompson, former Sergeant, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, Sniper Division." The effect on Colonel Rashid was immediate and dramatic. The man actually took a step backward, his confident posture wavering. "You lie," he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq," Marcus continued conversationally. "I spent 12 years hunting people who thought they could terrorize innocent civilians. Would you like to know how many of them are still alive?" Richard watched as other militia fighters began to shift nervously in their positions around the camp perimeter. Word was apparently spreading through their ranks about who they were facing. "Even if that's true," Colonel Rashid said, trying to regain his composure, "you are still outnumbered 50 to 1. Numbers don't matter as much as you think, Marcus replied. Especially not when you're dealing with someone who can put a bullet through your head. From 800 meters away, you have no rifle capable of such range, the colonel protested. Marcus gestured slightly and Richard understood the signal. From their supply cache, he retrieved the Barrett M82 sniper rifle that Marcus had insisted on bringing to the camp. The massive weapon was clearly visible as Marcus set it up on its bipod. 50 caliber, Marcus announced, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. Effective range 1,800 meters. That's more than enough to reach your vehicles, your command post, and every single one of your fighters currently surrounding this camp. Colonel Rashid stared at the weapon with obvious alarm. Every fighter in the region knew the reputation of the Barrett rifle, and most had seen the devastating damage it could inflict. You would not dare, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I've spent the last 6 months watching doctors save lives in this camp, Marcus said, settling behind the scope. I've seen nurses work 18-hour shifts to treat children dying from diseases that shouldn't exist in the modern world. I've watched aid workers risk everything to bring food and medicine to people who have nothing. Richard could hear the genuine emotion in Marcus's voice as he continued. So yes, Colonel, if you threaten these people, I will absolutely dare. The question is whether you're foolish enough to test me. A long silence stretched across the camp as Colonel Rashid weighed his options. Through his binoculars, Richard could see heated discussions taking place among the militia fighters. Several were already moving back toward their vehicles. You cannot protect this camp forever, the colonel finally called out. We know where you live, where you work. We will find another time, another way. No, you won't, Marcus replied with absolute certainty, because if you ever threaten this camp again, I won't wait for you to make the first move. I'll hunt you down first. The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that even Richard felt a chill. This was Marcus Thompson, the SAS sniper speaking, not Marcus, the humble security guard. Colonel Rashid apparently reached the same conclusion. After another moment of hesitation, he turned and walked back toward his vehicles. Within minutes, the entire militia force was retreating, leaving clouds of dust in their wake. Think they'll be back? Richard asked as they watched the vehicles disappear. Not those ones, Marcus replied, beginning to disassemble the sniper rifle. Word will spread about what happened here today. Other groups might try their luck eventually, but most of them will decide there are easier targets. As the immediate danger passed, refugees began emerging from their shelters. Dr. Amara appeared at Richard's side, having witnessed the entire confrontation. Once again, you've saved us all, she said to Marcus with deep gratitude. We all did our jobs, Marcus replied, deflecting the praise as usual. Richard coordinated the evacuation procedures perfectly, and your medical staff kept everyone calm. Richard felt a surge of pride at the acknowledgement. 6 months ago, he would have expected automatic recognition for his contributions. Now earning Marcus's professional respect meant more to him than any business accolade ever had. What happens now? Richard asked. Now we get back to work, Marcus said simply. Those supply trucks still need to be unloaded. The water purification system needs maintenance, and Dr. Amara has patients waiting. As they returned to their routine duties, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a wealthy businessman who measured success in profit margins and social status. The terrorist attack in London had shattered those priorities, showing him the difference between having value and being valuable. Marcus Thompson had been dismissed as a simple security guard by people who couldn't see past his uniform. But he had dedicated his life to protecting others, using skills earned through years of service in humanity's most dangerous corners. He had saved Richard's life twice now, once from terrorists, and once from a meaningless existence focused only on accumulating wealth. Marcus, Richard said as they helped unload medical supplies from the convoy trucks. Yeah, thank you. For everything. For saving my life, for teaching me what really matters, for letting me be part of this. Marcus paused in his work and looked at Richard seriously. You know what the best part is about people like you? He said. What's that? When you finally figure out what's important, you have the resources to make a real difference. Money isn't evil, Richard. It's just a tool. You've learned how to use that tool to save lives instead of just making more money. Richard smiled, looking around at the refugee camp that his funding helped maintain, and the medical staff his donations supported. For the first time in his adult life, He felt genuinely proud of his accomplishments. They returned to their work in comfortable silence. The former businessman and the deadly sniper who had become unlikely partners in protecting people who needed protection most. In the distance, children played between the tents while their parents received medical care, and their grandparents shared stories in the shade. It was exactly the kind of normal, peaceful scene that Marcus Thompson had spent his entire adult life fighting to preserve, and now Richard Pemberton understood why that fight was worth everything.